Now we move on to the next part of this module, that is international regulation of outer space activities. The relevance of the outer space in modern law has increased with technological innovations and its role in the various aspects of scientific progress and human life. Outer space has garnered unprecedented prominence in human civilization and mainstream life, especially after the launch of Sputnik. Outer space functions as the key space that make possible modern telecommunication and broadcasting easier. It also helps in remote sensing and geographical information systems, etc., which in turn supports an incredible range of activities like urbanization, increased technological advancement and reach, improved research, better land use and economic planning, increased scope for environmental protection, improved maritime navigation and fisheries, and military strategies, etc. Now, the question is, why do we need a regulation for outer space? The year 1957-58 was considered as an international geophysical year, which led to increased scientific discovery and innovation. This also resulted in the launch of many artificial satellites and rapid development of rocket technology. The improvement of rocket technology and the newfound possibilities for space flight set fire to a race between the then superpower duo, the United States of America and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, for dominance and control over outer space. Since then, about 1,200 satellites has reached the Earth's orbit, and it has also resulted in almost 500,000 pieces of space junk, including debris from various collisions, leftover rocket pieces, and decommissioned satellites that had run out of fuel. Apart from the race for orbital slots by all nations, several private commercial activities, including space tourism, have also been happening in the outer space. Regulation of governmental and private efforts on the activities in outer space is critical now to ensure that things do not go beyond control. When we look into the role of international law in outer space, we have to understand that the term space law is most often associated with the rules, principles and standards of international law appearing in the 5 international treaties and 5 sets of principles governing outer space developed under the auspices of the United Nations. The United Nations General Assembly Resolution 13 of 1958 was one of the first international legal instrument that accepted outer space as a subject of common interest of mankind and urged for the peaceful use of the area. It set up an ad hoc committee on peaceful uses of the outer space and a United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs. In 1959, the United Nations General Assembly replaced this ad hoc committee with a permanent committee on peaceful uses of outer space, or COPUS. In 1962, COPUS established a scientific and technical subcommittee and a legal subcommittee to conduct the activities. United Nations General Assembly Resolution 1721 of 1961 adopted the view that international law, including the Charter of the United Nations, applies to outer space and celestial bodies, and thus it was not to be considered as a lawless environment but rather a subject of the international law. This resolution also stressed on the point that the use of outer space should be for the betterment of the mankind and benefit of all states without subjecting them to the concept of national appropriation. The legality of these principles and their binding nature were generally accepted by the United Nations members, and most of the resolutions on space matters were passed unanimously in the United Nations General Assembly in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Now we will discuss a few 5 United Nations treaties on outer space. The 5 UN mediated international treaties on regulating outer space are: first, the Treaty on Principles Governing the Activities of States in the Exploration and Use of Outer Space, including the Moon and Other Celestial Bodies, 1967, also known as Outer Space Treaty. Second, the Agreement on the Rescue of Astronauts, the Return of the Astronauts and the Return of Objects Launched into the Outer Space, 1968, also called the Rescue Agreement. The third one, the Convention on International Liability for Damage Caused by Space Object, 1972, the Liability Agreement. Fourthly, the Convention on Registration of Objects Launched into Outer Space, 1975, the Registration Agreement. And finally, the fifth one, the Agreement Governing the Activities of States on the Moon and Other Celestial Bodies, 1979, also called the Moon Agreement. Now, we will discuss in brief these 5 agreements or conventions which have been concluded under the United Nations. The first one is the Outer Space Treaty. This is the treaty on principles governing the activities of states in the exploration and use of outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, 1967. The treaty provides the legal framework for the use and exploitation of the space for the benefit and in the interest of all countries. Every nation state has free access to the space on the basis of equality and encourages international cooperation and scientific research by nations in the outer space. Parties are obligated to keep the space a peaceful, non-militaristic zone and shall not send nuclear weapons into orbit around the Earth or on celestial bodies. The Outer Space Treaty prohibits the use of the moon and other celestial bodies for use as military bases, installations and fortifications, the testing of weapons and military maneuvers. The treaty urges to consider astronauts to be seen as the envoys of mankind, and it also prevents the states from harmful contamination of space and celestial bodies. The treaty is in force since October 1967. There are 104 ratifications and 107 members to state. The next one is the Rescue Agreement. It is the agreement on the rescue of astronauts, the return of astronauts and the return of objects launched into outer space, 1968. The treaty sets forth rights and obligations of states concerning the rescue of astronauts. The states are stipulated to take all possible steps to rescue and assist astronauts in distress and promptly return them to their launching states. The state shall also provide assistance to launching states in recovering space objects that while returning to Earth landed outside the territory of the launching state. This agreement was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 1967 and entered into force in December 1968 and currently has 94 ratifications. The next one is the Liability Convention. It's also known, the next one is the Liability Convention, that is a convention on international liability for damages caused by space objects, 1972. It expands Article 7 of the Outer Space Treaty, which deals with the liability of the nation states. It states that there is an international liability for damages caused by the space objects and settlements of disputes or claims. It covers 2 types of damages. The first one, damage to an aircraft in flight or to the surface of the Earth. Second, damage occurring in the space. The launching state has to pay compensation for damages caused by its space objects, and the claim for compensation can be made through diplomatic negotiations, and the failure leads to creation of a claims commission. The claims for compensations can be made through diplomatic negotiations. The failure of such negotiations can lead to a creation of a claims commission, and the decision of the claims commission is recommendatory in nature. It is only binding and final only when the parties agree to that particular decision. However, this convention needs further clarity in matters like the definition of launching states, joint launching, exclusion of potential damage, etc. The next one is the Registration Convention, that is the Convention on Registration of Objects Launched into Outer Space, 1975. The convention was concluded to assist in the identification of the space objects and entities that launch them. It requires 2 levels of registration for objects launched into the space. The first one, each object must be registered in a national registry of the launching state. Second, each state of registry must report the same to the United Nations Secretary General. Over 92% of all satellites, probes, landers, manned spacecrafts and space station flight elements have been registered with the Secretary General. This helps in the identification of a space object, and the state party failing to identify a space object may seek assistance of other parties. This agreement was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 1975. The next agreement is the Moon Agreement, or the agreement governing the activities of states on the moon and other celestial bodies, 1979. The agreement aims at encouraging scientific advancement of states in the exploration and use of the moon and other celestial bodies. The states have agreed under this instrument to use moon and other celestial bodies to be used exclusively for peaceful purposes and that their environments should not be disrupted. United Nations is to be informed of the location and purpose of any station established on those bodies. The agreement declares that the moon and its natural resources are the common heritage of mankind. It promotes equitable sharing of the benefits and international management system to manage the activities in moon and other celestial bodies. Adopted by the General Assembly in 1979, the Moon Agreement entered into force in July 1984. Currently, the agreement has 16 ratifications. Apart from these 5 agreements, there are other principles also which has been adopted by the United Nations General Assembly. They are Declaration of Legal Principles Governing the Activities of States in the Exploration and Use of Outer Space 1963, that is also called Declaration of Legal Principles. Next one, the principles governing the use by states of artificial earth satellites for international direct television broadcasting 1982, or the broadcasting principles. Third one, the principles relating to remote sensing of the earth from outer space 1986, the remote sensing principles. Fourth one, the principles relevant to the use of nuclear power sources in outer space 1992, also known as the nuclear power sources. Next one, the Declaration on International Cooperation in the Exploration and the Use of Outer Space for the benefit and in the interest of all states, taking into particular account the needs of developing countries, 1996, also the Benefits Declaration. Next one is the International Cooperation in the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space 2007, that is the International Cooperation Declaration, and also the Space Debris Mitigation Guidelines 2008 is also applicable. Now we have come to the end of this module. In this module, we have covered 2 major common heritages of mankind, that is outer space and the high seas. And we have seen various conventions, agreements, principles and United Nations efforts for protecting these 2 categories of common heritage of mankind. Apart from these conventions and agreements, it would be also good if the learners could look into the fisheries agreement between states and certain liability instances or payment instances under the outer space agreements for their further information. In this module, we have discussed various legal provisions relating to protection of high seas and outer space. And in this instance, I would also request the learners to look into further bilateral and multilateral agreements which governs this area, particularly the Convention on Migratory Species, the bilateral fishing agreements between various states, etc. And in case you have any further doubts, please refer to the online forum for further details. I wish all the luck for your exam. Thank you.